Tēnā rā tātou katoa. Good morning, everybody, and welcome. Stephen Cornter is my name, and I'll be the host for today and get you through from the start to the finish. It's my pleasure to introduce our speakers today. Firstly, Carleen Everett. Carleen is part of the ANZ team and is the head of Māori strategy. And we'll see Carleen pop up any moment now. And also our guest speaker for today, Sharon Zollner. Sharon is the ANZ Chief Economist, and you may have seen or heard Sharon in the media before, but certainly has, in terms of economic presentations, a fantastic style, and you'll certainly learn from her today. In terms of the session today and the first, disclaimer or important notice that we have for you, this is a complimentary service offered by the ANZ. We believe the information to be true and correct. However, the key thing, if you are making decisions about your business, about decisions in your business, then please do take the professional advice that you surround yourself with to make sure it is right and appropriate for you. We're using Zoom today, and Zoom lets you interact with the team. And firstly, you are muted, so we can't see or hear you. But the way to engage, you can pop up a little, reaction, smiley face, clap hand sort of thing. But more importantly, you can leave questions, and we will have time at the end to answer the questions that do come through. So please fire them through in the chat. And oh, there we are. We've got some hands up already. Thank you. And we'll look after those questions at the end. So there's the Zoom. This session is being recorded, and there will be a recorded version of it available through the ANZ website probably in about a week afterwards. So if there's anything you miss and need to come back to, then that will be available. It's now my pleasure to introduce Carleen to you, and Carleen for our mihi whakatau. So welcome along, and thank you, Carleen. Over to you.
Tā kiri arangi, tā kiri anuku, tā kiri tawatia kia Puāwai ke tau, te kare aro tō i. I a kurauranga tirama, e te ti, e te tā, nau mai, hara mai, ki tēnei anō te kōrero aupurangi nei, a kia Puāwai te Pakihi, te Ōhanga Māori. E honori nui tēnei kia mātou te whānau, o te pekini o te ANZ, i te mihi atu kia koutou. Nau mai, ara mai. Me tēnei anō o taku mihi atu, kia rātou koronga atu ki te karanga o ihoa. Aue rā, hoki wai irua e. Aue rā, hoki wai irua e. Rātou kia rātou, tātou kia tātou, a tēnā no koutou katoa. Hara mai ki tēnei anō te kaupapa o te Ōhanga Māori. Ka rongo atu ki tēnei anō te kōrero o tō mātou nei, manukura nei, o te Ōhanga, a mai te pekinu o te ANZ, a Sharon. He a tāho ki tēnā ona kōrero, me ona pukinga ki tēnei kaupapa e pāne ki te Ōhanga. E honore tēnei anō ki a mātou nei, ki anō ho ki tō koutou taha marungi te ipurangi. Just being a whakatau. Mihi, to welcome you all here, marunga te ipurangi, this webinar of kia Puāwai te Pakihi, te Ōhanga Māori. We've had a number of series of kia Puāwai te Pakihi. This particular series, we'll be hearing from Sharon Zollner, the Chief Economist, as Stephen has referred to talk to us about the Ōhanga Māori. So with that, tēnei anō te mihi nui rau atu kia koutou. Kia koutou e taumai nei ki tēnei anō te kōrero te Ōhanga Māori, mai tō mātou nei a manukura, a Sharon, i roto i tēnā koutou, tēnā no tātou katoa. With that, I'd like to welcome Sharon to the webinar. and she's going to take over controls and have a real good quarter to us in regards to the Māori economy. With that, over to you, Sharon. Tēnā koutou katoa.
Kia ora. E ngā mana, e ngā reo, raurangatira mā. Ngā mihi nui ki a koutou mō tā tainga mai ki tēnei kōrero i te Ōhanga Māori. Ko Sharon Zollner tōku ingoa, ko au te rangatira Ōhanga i ANZ. Tēnā koutou katoa. Kia ora everyone, and thank you very much for joining us today. Regret there's not better data out there about the Māori economy, but we do have a report done by Burl at the request of the Reserve Bank from 2018, which has some very interesting statistics in it, as well as some more up-to-date information that I will sprinkle through the presentation as we go along. But let's start with some figures. Ngā meka ngā tātou. So, asset base of the Māori economy, there are about 10,000, this is 2018, 10,000 Māori businesses roughly, with about $39 billion worth of assets, about 21 billion of assets held by trusts and corporations and other Māori entities, and about 8.6 billion in self-employed businesses, which is also a pretty significant chunk. So as you can see, the Māori economy is very, very large. If you look at what those assets are, they are largely in the primary sector, agriculture, forestry and fishing, and in real estate of various kinds, and then a smattering through the rest of it, but two very, very clear leaders there. You can break down that agriculture, that primary sector a bit more. Sorry, those numbers in that pie chart are meant to be billion, not percent, but about a third of it is sheep and beef, and then sort of a quarter is dairy, and forestry is similar size. Fishing and aquaculture, very important, obviously, particularly Ngāi Tahu there. And then there's other agriculture as well. So quite a wide range of primary sector assets there. And then manufacturing and transport make up number 3 and number 4. So that's the asset base, but in terms of GDP, if you like, GDP equivalent value-added activity, there really is quite a wide spread across the whole economy. But again, particularly the primary sector and property, they're the biggest two, followed by manufacturing and then construction. But really exposure to the whole economy, you'd have to say, looking at that chart. So, with that context, let's look at how things are going. So problem shared is not a problem halved. The New Zealand economy is experiencing very strong inflation, and that has been the case for a year now. We've had inflation over 7% for 4 quarters. And as you can see, it's looking very happy up there, very settled, which is of course not what the Reserve Bank wants at all. Other countries are experiencing something quite similar. Those countries with more exposure to the Russian energy shock have had higher inflation, but also more of a turn than New Zealand has had. But essentially, the same mistake was made everywhere. When COVID hit, it seemed reasonable to assume it would be a very long-lasting shock to demand, to spending, to confidence, to investment, to employment, that we were at risk of a depression, that house prices were going to fall double-digit. They have now. We were a little off with our timing of that forecast. So if you're expecting a really bad hole in demand, then of course you throw the kitchen sink at it, and that's what policymakers did. Both monetary policy and fiscal policy went all out. So of course we had the interest rate being cut, the restrictions on higher risk mortgage lending were suspended, the money was printed, there were make-work schemes. There was, of course, the wage subsidy, which was very important, very expensive, a whole lot of stuff thrown at the economy. And the good news is it worked. The bad news is it probably worked too well. So the domestic part of inflation that really reflects whether an economy is running hot or cold, it took off in 2021 at a pace which we've never really seen before. That bump in 2010 was GST, so you can ignore that. And then if the imported inflation, or the stuff that could be imported, things you can put on a boat, that also has taken off as well. So really a bit of a perfect storm, you'd have to say, on the inflation front. So inflation is way away from where it's supposed to be at 2%. It's running still over 7%. So if you ask firms what their biggest problems are, the big four either cause inflation or reflect it. So an inability to find staff, non-wage costs, wage costs, and regulation and paperwork. So the problems that the Reserve Bank needs firms to have are things like, we're stuck with far too much inventory. We'll have to discount it. Or, our costs have gone up, but when we tried to pass it through into our prices, we got pushback from consumers who have suddenly become more price sensitive. Those don't sound like fun problems either, but those are the sorts of problems that brings inflation down. That is what the Reserve Bank is trying to achieve. So far, you couldn't really say they've got there yet, but that's not a sign that monetary policy isn't working. It just takes time. So here's a longer term view, a more specific question. What is it that's limiting your firm from expanding production? And a very, very high proportion of firms say it's labour. And actually there was a survey from the Employment and Manufacturers Association that's in the Herald today suggesting this hasn't changed very much at all. Normally it's demand. So if someone came wanting a widget, you'd sell them a widget. But now it'd be like, I'm sorry, there's a 3-month waiting list for widgets, and we're short a few staff, so we're not able to produce widgets as fast as we normally would. And by the way, the price of a widget's gone up 7%. So quite a different sort of environment. The only similar period is the early 1970s. You don't really want to be able to draw too many parallels with the 1970s. They weren't a happy decade, but this is definitely one. So as part of the plan, the Reserve Bank is forecasting unemployment to rise, pretty much in a lift and shift like it did in 2008. So right out there on the street at the moment, it doesn't feel like it did when the global financial crisis hit. I mean, it did take a while for that to filter through from the people who watch Bloomberg obsessively to the person on the street. But there was a lot of media about it. There was a general sense of panic that isn't there today. So we also are forecasting the unemployment rate to rise, but it's hard to see in that chart, but a little bit later. We're not forecasting it to rise as high as it did in the last recession, but fair to say, uncertainty is pretty enormous. You can see how high unemployment can go. In the early 90s recession, it hit 11%. So if we can get away with half that, then that would be a good outcome in terms of how high it has been in the past, but obviously a terrible outcome for those who are affected by it. So yes, kora mahi, the unemployment, generally the business cycle tends to be a much wilder ride for Māori workers. So on the left-hand chart there, you can see Māori employment through various recessions. So employment drops and then recovers. The 2021 was interesting because that was a very strange recession. Of course, it was a health response hitting pause on the economy, and then boom, the economy took off again when the pause button was taken off. That you can see Māori employment actually rebounded very rapidly, and that was because the goods part of the economy rebounded really quickly. So as we discussed, the Māori businesses are quite exposed to the goods sector. But generally speaking, you can see there's quite big swings in Māori unemployment. If you compare it to European employment on the right-hand side, which I've deliberately put on the same scale, you can see we're not on the same roller coaster. The business cycle for European workers is a much gentler, less vomit-inducing one. That's definitely a wilder ride. And you can see that in the bottom charts as well, which is the employment rate bottom left, and the unemployment rate, which is more or less that turned upside down on the right. So you can see that in 1992, for example, the Māori unemployment rate hit a hair-raising, 26 or 27%. Then it went well under 10 just before the GFC hit, and at the moment it's quite low, as you would expect, given how tight the labour market is, but still higher than the national unemployment rate. So yes, the upshot of that is Māori workers have quite the stake in the business cycle. So sticking with the labour market, wage growth is very strong by any measure. You can compare to the peak of the last business cycle, and that is what you would expect when the labour market is so tight and inflation is high. Then of course workers are demanding compensation for inflation, and on average they're getting it. Of course, the minimum wage has gone up by 7%, so that's keeping pace with inflation. Average private sector wage inflation is actually has been as high as it was running over 8%, which is even more than inflation. Of course, there's a distribution of wage increases. Not everyone's getting the same number. Some are getting none, some are getting 20, depending partly on luck and depending on what sector they're in and all the rest of it. But on average, workers have been successfully keeping pace with inflation, and that actually makes New Zealand a bit unusual internationally. So cracks are starting to appear in the labour market now, and job ads starting to come off and that sort of thing, but from a really extreme starting point. You know, the measures of how tight the labour market has been have been off the charts over the last 12 months, and that has been can be a driver of persistent inflation. So rather than just petrol prices, which tend to wash through, you know, if you start getting into an environment where people expect higher wages, then they're going to object less to higher prices, and firms will object less to higher costs because they'll be confident that consumers are expecting them to raise their prices anyway because everyone else is doing it. You can kind of get into this treadmill of increases in costs and prices that it doesn't really make anyone better off. And that was the theme of a speech by Puāwai from the Reserve Bank this week, saying, well, we're all poorer now because of the cyclone, because of COVID, and we have to sort of accept that and be pragmatic about it, not try and recoup that lost income through fatter margins if you're a firm or through wage demands if you're a worker, because then we'll just get inflation. Saying, well, okay, you're right, but since when has telling people not to do what's best for them ever worked? You know, the wonders of capitalism is that a bunch of people behaving selfishly is supposed to aggregate into something highly efficient. Obviously, you need rule of law and the benefit system and all the rest of it to knock the rough edges off that. But yeah, I think it's a little bit optimistic to think you can change people's behaviour through a speech. People tend to respond to the incentives in front of them. If you can get a wage increase in a world of 7% inflation, why would you say, no, I'll take one for the team, give that to, you know, someone else, or actually don't give it to anyone. The Reserve Bank wouldn't want you to. Yeah, I don't think so. So where are Māori employed? We happen to have this chart in te reo, so I've thrown it in there in both languages there. Broadly, the pattern of Māori employment tracks the overall economy, however, with some differences. So essentially, Māori workers are overrepresented in the goods sectors, manufacturing, construction and agriculture, which served them very, very well in the 2020-21 period. Less so in services, particularly in the professional and administrative services. You can see there's quite a big difference in the proportion of Māori workers versus the overall economy in terms of workers. So at the moment, the economy's, we've had this boom in goods, and now as people are able to go on holidays again, for example, and able to go to shows and whatnot, we're seeing that spending switch back towards services. So here are employment intentions by sector. So having said that, Māori workers are most employed in manufacturing, construction and agri. You can see that that's the top sector, the bottom sector and the middle sector. So hedging bets there. But the one that stands out here is the construction sector, because it is the most sensitive to interest rates. So it rocketed out when interest rates were slashed and the LVRs suspended and the housing market went nuts. Construction obviously found itself very short-staffed very quickly. But now the housing market is the part of the economy cooling the most dramatically because it is rate sensitive. So you can see that in the construction sector employment intentions. On the other hand, manufacturing is holding up very well, for example. So in case of win some, lose some there, I would say. Overall, though, it's important to note that construction intentions aren't particularly weak. They're roughly about the levels they were before COVID. Firms would be pretty reluctant to let staff go after they've fought so hard to get them. So migration obviously has a big impact on the labour market and the economy as a whole. Unfortunately, the data gets revised a lot, but it does make sense that we've had a surge in both incomings and outgoings after a period of a closed border. The net numbers, the best guesstimate, I would call it, is that we're back about where we were in the years before COVID, except for 2019, which really was one out of the box. Now that increases labour supply, putting downward pressure on wages, which is of course why the Labour government was reluctant to throw the gates fully open again. But it also boosts demand, particularly and immediately, for housing. And that can impact both house prices and rents. It immediately means more housing demand. Now, of course, we've actually made some real strides in recent years in closing the housing shortages, particularly in Auckland. Made less progress, obviously, in places like Tauranga and Queenstown. But yeah, population growth naturally and means you're moving the goalpost. So it's not clear for the Reserve Bank what the net impact on inflation is going to be. The upshot is they're not going to assume that it's going to solve their inflation problem by dampening wages, nor are they going to assume that it's going to worsen their inflation problem by boosting rents and house prices. They're just going to wait and see what happens to wages and what happens to rents and house prices, which is very sensible, I would say, given the uncertainty. But it does just mean more lags in terms of understanding where the economy is at and where it's going. In terms of where things are going, you can see on the left, the Australian labour market is incredibly tight as well. So we are seeing a lot of 20-somethings leave the country, some of them going to Australia, some to the UK. I mean, this is queued up OE, so it's all very fair and reasonable, but we actually saw employment amongst 20-somethings fall in the last read. In fact, the biggest lift in participation in employment was teenagers. Queenstown is literally being run by 14-year-olds. Well, at least their dishes are being done by 14-year-olds. My nephew's making $26 an hour washing dishes in Queenstown. Of course, he doesn't have an accommodation problem. He lives with his mum. But that is Queenstown's problem, nowhere to live. So our inflation forecasts are for inflation to come back as neatly and tidily as it went up. That's a very reasonable forecast. It's internally consistent. The impact of interest rates on first housing and then construction and retail and then employment and then feedback loops and all that sort of thing should be disinflationary. And as I said, there are early signs that it's working. But when you think about the risks around inflation, yes, there's a risk on the downside that we could have a harder landing than expected, either because the Reserve Bank, the delays in seeing what damage they've already done to the economy, but also because of the wobbles in the US banking sector, for example, that with the globe could have a harder landing than expected. And of course, we would be affected by that. But on the other side, there's lots of risks to the upside. Weather, for one. You know, fresh fruit and vegetable inflation is running well over 20% in New Zealand. That's a big chunk of that is weather impacts. But also efforts to mitigate climate change. We need to change our energy sources away from the cheapest ones to more expensive ones, essentially. That's inflationary. Geopolitics, the fact that China and the US are pulling apart now rather than growing together. That plus pandemic risk is making everyone rethink their global supply chains. And obviously, we could have left field events there as well. So I think the risks are tilted on the whole towards inflation not so neatly going back to 2%, that it might get halfway and then get stuck, or it might just fall too slowly and then people just start building 5% or 4 or 5% inflation into their decision making going forward. I see the risks as tilted in that direction, but not exclusively in that direction. So, of course, there's more to the cost of living than is just in the CPI. And the big one that's not in there is interest costs. So that chart on the left shows the cost of living index for Māori households. And you can see a big mover has been food. A big mover in recent times, though it's backed off, is transport. That's essentially petrol prices. You can see interest costs in the teal growing there at the end. For example. So, I mean, obviously the cost of everything's gone up and everyone's noticed that. But in terms of the mix of what people spend their money on, Māori households tend to be less exposed to interest rate rises. That reflects a lower home ownership rate, essentially. Rent and food are big items. The weights on the top right, also Māori have a higher rate of smoking, so they're more exposed to increases in that as well. Overall, if you look at how the cost of living has increased, it's been dramatic for everyone, but the Māori population's there in the orange, kind of middle of the band there. But you can see it's more than the rate of inflation because some things have gone up that are not in the CPI, particular interest rates. So that non-tradable inflation, those big surprises, that has driven everyone's changes to their forecast of how high interest rates need to go. There was finally a downward surprise, and confidence kind of tanked after the Reserve Bank raised rates 75 basis points in one hit, which is absolutely unheard of in November. So we actually revised down our peak for how high interest rates would need to go. Then we saw confidence bounce back, the manufacturing bounce back, the job ads bounce back, everything started bouncing back. And we're like, oh my goodness, okay, that was the wrong thing to do. But then the global stuff happened with banks. And so so now we're sitting in a position of possibly being right for the wrong reasons, but we'll take it. So as you can see, it's been a pretty dramatic change. So back at the start of 2021, we were all debating, will the OCR go to 0.5% or 1%? Now we're sitting here debating, will it go to 5% or 5.5%? I would say within a couple of years, it could be somewhere between 0% and 10%. I mean, that's not very helpful, is it? But that is a realistic reflection of the uncertainty of the situation we find ourselves in. So that neither of those scenarios is appealing, but I just to outline scenarios. 0% would be global financial crisis Mark II, essentially. So everything goes splat. Inflation goes splat as well. That would be the only good thing about that scenario. So OCR gets cut right back. The 10% scenario would be something, for example, a big oil shock could do it, or perhaps the US financial system remains just wobbly enough that central banks don't feel they can do what's actually needed to root out inflation, and inflation gets stuck, say 7%, and then the official cash rate has to go higher just to play catch up. That's a couple of out there scenarios, but not unthinkable scenarios that kind of underline the uncertainty of the world that we are dealing with at the moment, because it's not just the end of another business cycle. We've had the biggest policy mistake possibly, well, in recent history. And it comes on top of a big increase in debt in 2008. We've had another massive increase in debt in 2020. So it is a pretty high stakes kind of game out there. What's also very unusual at the moment is that we've got Adrian Orr basically admitting he is deliberately engineering a recession. So normally you find out you're in recession when you're halfway through it. This one has been advertised in advance. Come and get your recession here. But that does also raise questions about whether the market is right to assume that central banks will slash interest rates the minute we're in recession. If that's what they were trying to achieve, why would they then hit reverse immediately and try and get us out of it? The recession is the medicine. But now markets are pricing aggressive rate cuts around the world, most dramatically in the US, but even here in New Zealand next year, on the assumption that these financial wobbles could cause a harder landing. So some good news, household debt is not as high as you might assume once you deflate it by income growth. So given we've just had the biggest housing boom in our history, that is a surprising fact. But the fact is that the employment rate is pretty much at record highs, and the wage growth has been really strong as well. So you put those two things together and you're deflating that higher debt by a much bigger number. Also, the bank lending has been much more prudent than it was in the run-up to the global financial crisis. So what that means is that the level of household debt is not the lid on how high the OCR can go that you might assume. So the proportion of household income that's being spent on mortgages is currently about 5%. On our forecast, it's going to, as people roll over onto fixed mortgages, it'll go through 10. So that's a doubling, not to be sneezed at, but just to put that in context, it did hit 16% in 2008. So it's, I mean, I'm not saying it won't hurt, particularly those who bought houses in 2021 with very large mortgages, of course, but it's not true that the Reserve Bank's putting an unprecedented burden on households as a whole. Only a bit over a third of households even have a mortgage. And of course, Māori households, it would be a lower proportion than that. They're more exposed to rents, which are now starting to move as landlords are looking at the minimum wage increase and the benefit increases and wage increases generally, and looking at the increase in their interest bills and the tax change, which has made their cash flow positions more difficult, and going, oh, I want some of that. So we're starting to see a bit of upward pressure on rents as well. So we have seen a bit of a disjoint between what households have been saying and what they've been doing. They've been saying it's a terrible time to spend money, but they've been doing it anyway. As you can see, a big gap has opened up there. The volatility is unfortunate. That's the COVID lockdowns and the ricocheting around in the data. This has made it very difficult to try and get a read on where the economy is really at. But the overall theme has been people have been very confident they're going to keep their job, and on average have been seeing much higher wage increases than we've seen for some time. So of course that money's not going as far with inflation, but that's not a reason not to spend the same proportion of your income that you were spending before. Or put another way, it's not a reason to save a whole lot of money. It's just that you get less for your money, and that's really annoying. But threat of unemployment would be a very good reason to save more of your income. So those two scenarios are not the same. So job security is really important when it comes to people's spending. So just talking about the housing market a bit more, yeah, it was a very dramatic cycle, as you can see. We were debating what we could do about our terrible housing affordability before COVID, and then house prices went, threatened to go exponential, and then gravity finally hit. So our forecast is for a 22% house price fall, which is bizarrely a soft landing. I mean, that's how stupid the increase was, that we can describe a 22% fall as a soft landing. And that would be a 32% fall in real house prices if you deflate them by wage growth. So the nominal house prices are what matters in terms of how many people are getting tipped into negative equity. So on our forecast, it's surprisingly few, given how intense but relatively brief that housing boom was. But in real terms, that's what matters for housing affordability. We would land somewhere a little bit better in terms of affordability, a little bit worse if you've bought a house for capital gain, than in those years before COVID hit. So that does look like a soft landing. It would still leave real house prices higher, a lot higher actually than they were in 2010. Real house prices would have to fall, a half. They would have to halve rather than fall by a third to get to that level. But that's not necessarily the bottom either. If you look at where house prices have gotten to relative to incomes or to rents, we've really only just unwound a bit of the madness. 2010 isn't the bottom either. That house prices were a lot higher then, a lot less affordable than in 1998, for example. And if you remember the 1990s, house prices in 98 were an awful lot higher than they were in 1990. So we've had a long running increase in house prices. Affordable is considered 3 to 5, and we haven't seen that for 20 years. So there is no obvious floor for where house prices could stop if we did go into a really nasty recession where unemployment really jumped and a lot of people had to sell their house. At the moment, people are listing their house thinking, I don't like this cash flow much, getting offended by the offers that they're getting and choosing not to sell it again. If we're in a time when people don't have that luxury, then you could see what's been a very, very orderly slowdown in the housing market turn into something a bit uglier. Of course, the construction sector is very exposed to what's happening with house prices, and the construction sector in our survey is not optimistic. Ignore the lockdown, but basically, apart from that, this is the lowest it's been. It's lower than 2008. And consents, the relationship's not perfect, but they are falling in line with what our survey has been saying. So construction costs are still high, house sales are weak, house prices are falling, interest rates are high. It makes the maths pretty difficult on a spec build now. So that, I think, explains why the construction sector is feeling the chill winds first. And as I mentioned, the construction sector is a pretty popular sector for Māori workers. So it does suggest that residential investment, so house building, could slow a bit more quickly than the Reserve Bank is currently forecasting. But it could be that that sector is overstating the weakness. So turning to agriculture, Susan from our team is the guru in this, but essentially there's some big global themes. Inflation, as I mentioned, a problem in most countries. So interest rates are rising everywhere. That should weaken the economies and that will impact demand for our exports. China's doing its own thing to some extent. They don't have strong inflation, but they've got a few issues of their own. They've got a popping property bubble that makes ours look normal and sane. They've just suddenly abandoned COVID zero, so they're having a bounce in demand, which is a positive for their demand in the short run. They've got terrible demographics though. In fact, 30 years of a one-child policy is really starting to hit them now, and that's something they can't easily reverse. And of course, their deteriorating relationship with the US is a risk for countries like New Zealand and Australia, who really sit between the two, with China being our most important export market, but the US being our most important strategic partner. That, you know, we've done pretty well dancing between the elephants, but you can't rule out a scenario where we end up having to choose between our best friends who aren't getting along. Yeah, that would be a problem. Environmental concerns obviously to the fore for the agriculture sector. Globally, there's water shortages and heat waves affecting production. Obviously here in New Zealand, we've got rain falling intensely in the wrong places, and that's had a huge impact on our food prices here. Also the need to address greenhouse gas emissions. And yeah, it's probably fair to say we're still finding the right balance in terms of how we do that. Regulation, emissions trading schemes, the price of carbon, how much agricultural land should be converted to forestry. None of these issues are easy, but all else equal, the more land that's put into trees, the lower our meat exports, for example, are. Political unrest globally, the market is doing its capitalist thing and sort of working its way around that. Energy markets and grain markets have normalised to a large extent, but costs are still very high for New Zealand agricultural producers, fertiliser and fuel, anything imported really, although fuel prices have come back. Still very difficult to get hold of agricultural machinery. So, and we've actually revised down our dairy forecast 25 cents for this season and next, as on a string of disappointing global dairy trade auctions. And yeah, the new crosswind, financial stresses emerging in pockets, suggesting a risk that the global economy could have a harder landing, which wouldn't be so good for the New Zealand agriculture sector. So in terms of lamb prices, that we've got them towards the middle of the range of the last few years. Global beef and lamb prices, you can see similar sort of dynamics. They were very high for a period, but now they've come back to much more average levels. And dairy prices and oil prices, they tend to move surprisingly closely together. And that is basically the global growth cycle there. Dairy and oil are not substitutes. But yeah, while we'd love to have high dairy prices and low oil prices, that chart suggests we're not going to get that mix, that we're going to have both high or both low. So at the moment it's been downward, which at least has the silver lining that reduces inflation pressure. Some more good news, global shipping has normalised to a huge extent, and that's obviously enormously helpful for New Zealand being at the end of the world, the last bus stop. So yeah, anecdotally, it hasn't been uniform, and New Zealand is still facing higher shipping costs than some of the more major routes where things have normalised more. But firms are reporting less disruption and getting goods into the country, for example, and generally falling shipping costs in and out. So the current account deficit, it's a horrible statistic. It's very confusing, and it doesn't get talked about much, but it is starting to raise eyebrows at the moment. So you can think of it as our current account, as our credit card bill with the rest of the world. So it incorporates our trade deficit, which, you know, we've been importing a lot of stuff because we're all feeling rich because our house prices went up so much or whatever, or because our job security was excellent. We've been importing a lot of stuff. And of course the border was closed, so that put the kibosh on tourism and foreign students. They're now coming back, but early days. And the income balance, basically that's, we can think of it essentially as interest rates. When they go up, New Zealand is a net debtor nation, so that means our interest bill to the rest of the world goes up. So all those three things combined have seen our current account deficit blow out to 8.9% of GDP, which really is a rate that people start looking sideways at you. So we've already seen a ratings agency say, well, if we don't see some improvement pretty soon, then we might downgrade you. But the good news is recessions are great for current account deficits. Look at 2008. So yeah, that's why it's a weird statistic. But basically that means that if we start consuming and investing less, then we start importing a lot less goods, essentially, start going away on a lot fewer overseas holidays. Those things improve the current account deficit, for example. But essentially this is a risk that if people are looking at risk of all kinds and going, oh, don't like that now, then we could see our currency fall out of bed. And that would obviously be inflationary and mean that Reserve Bank has to raise rates by more. But also people might look sideways at the government and go, well, your country's not paying its way. We're going to actually charge you a little bit more to borrow. Or banks, when they go offshore, because New Zealand is a net debtor nation, we just deposits aren't enough to support the lending we want to do. We actually need to raise some funds offshore. It's possible that they might decide to charge us a bit more for that as well. So you could see a change in the mix of monetary conditions towards a lower currency but higher interest rates, and that could mean a more abrupt and brutal adjustment path to a more sustainable position than we would choose if it were up to us. Essentially. So that's what that represents. So basically, it's not just Adrian Orr on his soapbox saying we need to cool our jets. There are other things that are also saying that this economy's gotten quite out of whack, actually, and needs to get back onto a more sustainable path. So finally, if you help run a business, like CFO, CEO, that sort of thing, we would love to have you in our business outlook survey. It takes a couple of minutes a month. You know, there was a lot of data from that survey in this presentation. It's been an absolute godsend. And on the right hand side, that is a link to sign up to our research if you don't already get it. It's a self-service portal there. Yeah, if you prefer to just jot things down with a pen to QR codes, nzeconomics@anz.com. And on the right-hand side, research.anz.com is our research portal. Okay. And will you take back control of the slides now?
Yes, we'll look after that.
Great.
So, thank you, Sharon. And as we promised at the beginning, we're certainly seeing there's a lot of information to take in, and we do have some questions that have come through. Just before we get to that, I just want to detour onto what we're doing in terms of from the ANZ supporting businesses. And not only it's these webinars, we've had a number of our Māori in Business sessions, but there's also a number of recordings available and webinars coming up to, essentially train business owners on business skills around cash flow, around marketing, around leadership, around networking, business planning, all sorts of things. So the access to those is through the anz.co.nz/bizhub, and certainly we would love to see people attending those, and we can demonstrate our tangible support to business owners. Righto, so we've got some questions coming through, Sharon. One that's probably very topical, and you did touch on this around the New Zealand banking system, and really just an overview on the chances of banks in New Zealand failing like we've seen in the US.
Yeah, I'm happy to report that New Zealand banks and SVB have very little in common, apart from both being banks. Indeed, it appears that the management at SVB was really quite appalling, and there could be criminal charges laid, I think, before the end of this. Essentially, the US banking has three tiers. There's the big systemically important banks that have been watched like hawks ever since 2008. Then there's the little squitty guys that all their deposits are guaranteed because they're quite low tier, so that they're not a concern either. But then there's this middle tier that lobbied Donald Trump in 2018. Hey, it's not fair. This regulatory burden is killing us. And Trump went, yeah, what's that about? And chucked it away. So that's the tier of banks that's causing concern. And interestingly, it wasn't, normally people think banks get into trouble because the people aren't paying their loans back. That wasn't the problem at all. I mean, that may become a problem down the track as the US economy slows, but this was all about what they'd done with their deposits. So essentially, all their customers are tech firms, and they had heaps of money in there, millions and millions of dollars, but just overnight on call, so able to be taken out in a flash. And yet they treated them like those deposits were locked in forever and invested them in very long-term things that then lost money, and didn't really front up to that. And when they did front up, everyone went, what? And then social media being what it is, it started a bit of a scramble to take deposits out, and it all snowballed extremely rapidly from there. So New Zealand banks are very different. We have something that was introduced after 2008 called the core funding ratio, which basically means our funding has to be to a much greater extent locked in a term deposit or in much longer term foreign funding. So if we had a multi-million-dollar overnight deposit, it wouldn't even count as funding because because it is so flighty, whereas they didn't have that kind of regulation. So New Zealand banks are very well capitalised and they have that more secure funding than they had previously. But perhaps most importantly, we don't have many new TLAs. 3-letter acronyms are starting to pop up everywhere, and that's never a good sign. But New Zealand banking system is very plain vanilla. It does what it says on the tin. You know, maybe you can criticise it as not being innovative enough, but at times like this, innovation is actually a bit of a negative. People just want to understand exactly what a bank is doing, and the New Zealand banking sector is pretty plain vanilla and pretty transparent.
All right, lovely. Maybe a little bit more back on, not sort of back on topic, but around the Māori economy. And the question is, we're seeing a rise in embracing of Māori culture in business, leadership styles, names of departments, etc. Are you seeing any impacts that this is having on the New Zealand economy, or the way that industries or businesses are operating? And probably I'll turn to both of you for this as well.
Well, it would be very hard to measure the impact of anything like that. Yeah, unfortunately, macroeconomic data does have quite a lot of limitations. I might hand over to Carleen to talk about what she's seeing. That this is really her field.
Yeah, well, kia ora. Hey, look, I mean, ANZ is case in point. We now have our own Māori strategy, which is Whakiriarangi. It takes us out to 2040. That sets a pathway for us as ANZ and how we can support Māori in business, our whānau at home, in terms of, you know, growing your business and also supporting you in the work that you're doing to support whānau. So, you know, yes, we are seeing that, and this is a movement across Aotearoa, New Zealand, and, you know, I'm really proud that we're embracing this. In terms of how we can measure the outcome, there's going to be some key pieces that I think that you'll see come through. Particularly, if I think about ANZ, we've been working really hard on our own ANZ Reo Māori program, and just a big, huge acknowledgement of Stephen and Sharon. You would have heard them, you know, trying really hard in terms of the introductions in Te Reo Māori. And yes, we've still got so much more to do. And I'm really pleased where we're heading to with this. We have a real responsibility as ANZ. One is that we've acknowledged our history as ANZ, but equally it's also about our pathway and our guideline going forward, I think, Stephen, on that particular question. I think, you know, I acknowledge that there was a State of the Nation speech last week. And that's going to happen. This is a political year that we're in. We're going to see many more comments of such nature. But with a key strategy in place that ANZ has is Whakiriarangi, ANZ's Te Ao Māori strategy out to 2040, you know, we've got a clear guideline that really takes us forward in this space, you know, to help us together, really help our communities thrive. Back to you, Stephen.
Okay, cool. A couple of questions, so we can two birds, one stone here. Sharon, how is a Māori business defined? You know, there were some stats early in your presentation. So, what classifies a business to fall into the Māori data?
Excellent question, and I've been frantically Googling trying to find it. That those stats about the both the asset base and the value added to GDP come from a Burl report commissioned by the Reserve Bank in 2018. And so I've got the link to that in front of me, but I haven't yet managed to find how they managed to define that, because it's obviously not a simple thing to do, and they do describe their numbers as estimates for that reason. So I think,
Stephen, if I can respond to that, MB did some work on this. Some Māori businesses identified of shareholding and at the governance level of leadership of the business at 50% owned, operated by Māori. Then they now have a New Zealand Māori business number as well that Māori businesses can apply through MB, so they can have that recorded as a Māori business. I think the key piece here, which is something that I have, you know, always held on to, it is about, as Māori, when we look at being in business, we look at business over multi-generations. We look at this not just not just as ourselves, but actually for our whānau, for our hapu, for our mokopuna, the future generations that will follow in our footsteps. There's the key connectivity that we have as Māori, both to Papatūānuku and Te Ranginui. And there are a number of other factors of which values play a key piece in this as a Māori business. But EMB have noted that in shareholding is 50% owned by Māori.
All right, thank you.
Back to you, Stephen.
Right, another question here regarding government procurement increased to 8% from 5% with the Māori businesses. So maybe, Sharon, have you got any insight around that? And then Carleen, I'm not quite sure whether this is in your scope or not, but is that something that also the bank is considering as well?
Yeah, sorry, I don't have anything to add on that. So
okay, cool. Just it is.
Happy to catch the ball on that one there.
Cool.
From
Thank you,
Stephen. Hey, look, so firstly to acknowledge Samutai. Samutai have been an entity that has been established to support Māori in business, and they've been growing their registration base of Māori in businesses. I really acknowledge them. Equally is that there are other businesses out there that have supported Māori in business. The procurement strategy piece led out by government, and I acknowledge that announcement at ANZ. Our procurement teams have been working through this process, and we're really excited about where we're heading to. I think I want to share these words, Stephen, if I may, from our tupuna, from our ancestor, Sir James Henare. He said this in 1984. Ko tāwhitike tō haranga mai kia kore e haere tonu. Tino nui rawau mahi kia kore mahi nui tonu. Which means, in effect, is that we've gone so far. We've got a lot more work to do in that space. I'm speaking from us as ANZ. We've done a lot and a lot more work for us to do. The opportunity for procurement, for Māori procurement across business. I know looking at government, local government, but for us as well in the private sector and how we support this. Because I think this comes down to your very point, Sharon, in your slides when we looked at, where Māori are based in the sectors. We are based primarily in the agribusiness primary sector, but actually there's a big part of us as well, Māori in business, that are operating in the retail space, that are operating in the property and property services space. How do we look at this more in a, hate to use the word, but I'm going to, but more innovatively to really support the strategy and the announcement by government of the 8% increase from 5% to 8%. So yeah. I am really enjoying my discussions and the leadership that's coming from our teams in regards to Māori procurement. Okay,
thank you, Carleen. Another question here, and it should still be quite topical with regard to Cyclone Gabriel. Will this have a more significant effect on the Māori economy than the greater economy, based on the number of agriculture and horticultural businesses?
Yeah, no, I think that probably is fair. Also, given the population base that's in Tairāwhiti and in that region, it was pretty clear that Gisborne, for example, was hit really, really hard. So yes, I do suspect there would have been a disproportionate impact on the Māori economy from that event. In terms of the broader economy, the basic pattern was that a few people got severely impacted, as opposed to a large number of people being slightly impacted. So from a macroeconomic perspective, it's probably not enough to tip the business cycle one way or another, but obviously for the people who are impacted, it's been quite devastating in some cases, and so there's clearly a role for the government to step up there, but monetary policy isn't the right tool. If they cut rates because of the cyclone, they'd probably just set the Auckland housing market on fire again, and then how would that help the Hawke's Bay and Tairāwhiti recover? So I think it is fiscal policy that the right tool for that job.
Okay, just a bit of a shout out, really. Oops, I've lost it. And thank you, Pania. And Sharon, just directed at you really, but not a question, but wow, Sharon is so engaging to listen to. I enjoyed listening to her kōrero. This presentation was awesome. So there you go. So there's one
Thank you.
as well, and I'm sure that is echoed by others. One last question, and we sort of touched on this as well, but it's probably, you know, in terms of Māori economy and how it's impacting people. Given the increase in the cost of living being 8%, do we not have a disproportionate impact on households despite not being directly related to interest rate hikes? For example, Māori incomes, have they gone up by a similar amount? And we'll probably just take this as our last question. And I know there are some of you that have put questions through. We will respond to those because they're a little bit off sort of the general topic, and we'll respond to those directly. So Sharon.
Yeah, I haven't seen any data on Māori wages versus general wages, but we have seen quite a lot of upward pressure on wages at the lower end, in the more physical goods producing spaces. So hopefully that's helpful. Obviously the minimum wage increasing 7.2%, that sort of thing. What we've seen in those cost of living indexes most recently is that the cost of living has increased the most for the higher income earners, because they are the ones who have the most access to borrowing, and so they have the largest mortgages. And so you know, but that is just a tiny reversal of what's been a much longer running theme, which is that the cost of housing in particular, rents and house prices as well, but the cost of housing and food has been outpacing the general rate of inflation for quite some time. And that of course hits lower income earners the hardest. So, you know, I wouldn't say, oh, that poor 1%, their mortgages are really hurting them. You know, that is only a small reversal of what's been a longer running issue of the basics getting more expensive while the nice to haves have gotten cheaper relatively.
Yeah, okay, cool, thank you. Righto, well, we will wrap up the session now. Firstly, from me, thank you to the team in the background and for all of you for attending. Thank you to Sharon and to Carleen, and thank you all for joining us and being part of this session. And as I said at the very beginning, this event has been recorded, and we will have a recorded version of this available on the ANZ website, probably, you know, within the week, I would hope. So Carleen, I will pass over to you just to close and to thank, and we'll finish up. So Carleen, over to you.
Kia ora, tēnā koutou katoa. Tēnā koutou mō tō koutou nuhanga kei wangana i a tātou. E piri ana i a tātou ki a tātou ki te ronga atu ki tēnei ano te kōrero mai kia Puāwai te Pakihi, te Ōhanga Māori. E kōrero mai a Sharon, e kōrero mai ano a pēke nui o ANZ, kia koutou. Tēnā koutou, i roto i tēnei ano, tākiri rangi, tākiri anuku, tākiri tawatia, kia Puāwai ki te ao, te kare aroto e. Have a wonderful rest of the day, everyone. Kia ora.